Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Cleet Roberts here. Welcome to 28 Tonight. Tonight we will discuss the pending Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT II. And with us is a representative of the Soviet Union to discuss this issue. This agreement is the product of nearly 6 years of tough bargaining between the United States and the Soviet Union. While not yet completed, accord has been reached on many of its provisions, and reports indicate that signing is, as they say, within striking distance. Whether the Senate will ratify SALT is uncertain, and there are varying estimates of public support for SALT. Some polls show that 85% of the American people agree that it is vital for us to reach an agreement on nuclear arms, but others estimate that 57% believe that we should forget a treaty and build up our strength. What is certain is that right now both sides have immensely powerful strategic nuclear forces. The United States leads in some categories, and the Soviet leads in others. The State Department calls this situation nuclear parity. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara called it MAD, M-A-D, short for Mutual Assured Destruction. Proponents of SALT II claim that the treaty will aid nuclear stability. Right now, this is conjecture, but what is known is that initially, under SALT, each country will be limited to 2,400 nuclear delivery vehicles. This will be reduced to 2,250 before 1985. In addition, there will be 3 sub-limits placed on weapons systems, plus a number of agreements to exchange data and to limit the production of new weapons systems. The State Department contends that the United States will not rely on trust to determine if the Soviets are complying with SALT, but the loss of our listening posts in Iran has prompted questions about our abilities to monitor Soviet compliance. Even though President Carter insists that we have the means to monitor the Soviets, verification promises to become one of the major issues in the Senate's ratification debate. Now, to find out more about SALT's chances in the Senate, earlier this week, this reporter talked to Senator Alan Cranston, and Cranston, as you may know, is the majority whip in the Senate, and he will be a key man in any deliberation, and we asked him where he stood on SALT.
Before it, I'm preparing to help lead the battle for it. I've organized a group of senators of both parties that are studying it with care who hope to support it and get it through, but I'm reserving judgment. I want to know the final details of the treaty, and as we're talking, it has not yet been finally negotiated.
Well, you have a large task ahead of you as the Senate Majority Whip when this discussion of the SALT Treaty really gets to the floor of the Senate. It'll take a 2/3 majority, that's right.
It takes 2/3 of those present voting. If all 100 senators are present, and they probably will be, barring serious illness, we have to have 67 votes to ratify.
Do you have any notes on the back of an envelope right now? Is that who's for it, who's against it?
Yes, I have notes in great detail on
Want to give me some
my
ballpark
estimate.
figures?
Yes, I come out about this way, and this is what I do most frequently on issues that I'm particularly concerned about, is try to estimate where the votes are and what can be done to get the votes we don't have. I think about 40 senators are strongly inclined to be for SALT, like I am, but we're waiting for the details to be sure. About 20 are strongly inclined to oppose and will almost surely oppose no matter what the merits of the treaty. I think about 10 more lean pro, about 10 more lean anti, making it 50-30, and 20 are unpredictable at this point. So it's hard to predict how it will come out. I think it's a very tough battle. I know it's a very tough battle, but I think it can be won. And if it's a good treaty, I think it's incredibly important to win ratification. I view the task of trying to reduce the danger of nuclear war as the most important problem confronting the human race and the most important issue that I will deal with in my time in the United States Senate. So I'm preparing as best I can to be effective in this battle, because there's no more important battle for me to be effective in on behalf of the people of California and the nation and the world than this issue of avoiding nuclear war, reducing the dangers of nuclear war. SALT II is not the total answer to that, but it's a step on the long journey of ridding the human race of the threat of nuclear war.
With us tonight are Yuri Kaprelov, the first secretary of the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C., Albert Pierce from the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Roman Kolkowitz, the director of International Strategic and Defense Studies at UCLA, and Ron Young, Peace Education Director for the American Friends Service Committee. And gentlemen, welcome. I think I'd like to put the first question to you, Mr. Kolkowitz, and that is to ask you what concerns you have about the SALT Treaty.
The SALT Treaty presumably is to serve three major goals: to prevent the outbreak of war, to assure good relationship with the Soviet Union, and possibly reduce the defense costs. I am concerned that the SALT Treaty as it presently is presented to the American people is not likely to serve very well some or possibly all of these primary objectives. At the same time, I ought to say, I believe it's important to sign the treaty and to have it ratified, because the absence of it, I believe, would be worse than actually the signing of such a treaty.
Well, Mr. Young, what's your feeling about this?
The American Friends Service Committee, as a Quaker organization, is concerned to work for the total abolition of war. Right now, we are emphasizing the need to stop all production of nuclear weapons, calling for a nuclear moratorium. So one of our concerns about the treaty is that at the same time that the treaty may represent, and we believe it probably does represent, a step toward controlling the nuclear arms race, the Carter administration is, it seems, to gather support for the treaty, announcing plans to develop even new and dangerous weapon systems, such as the MX, continued development of the neutron bomb, continued work on the Trident submarine. So we're troubled that we seem to be losing ground in terms of arms control and disarmament at the same time that the SALT Treaty is supposed to make a step toward greater arms control and disarmament.
I sense a kind of a qualified approval on the part of both of you of the SALT thing. Is that,
that's true for AFSC.
That is comment on that in any way, Mr. Pierce?
Well, I think that I would agree with Dr. Kolkowitz in terms of three of the broad goals of SALT, and I think he's quite right in pointing out that this treaty, no piece of paper, or no single program of any kind can guarantee 100% success in each of those goals. I think one of the fundamental facts of life that we have learned in the nuclear age is that to prevent the outbreak of nuclear war, to maintain our security, it takes both arms and arms control, and we have to maintain a strong and flexible defense at the same time that we try to reduce the burden of arms and the dangerous development.
I'm not ignoring you, Mr. Kupperleff. I have
no complaint.
I have a question for you, and I'm going to save it for just a moment here. But what is the? Do you have any area of serious disagreement here with the position on of the administration? And that is, neither one of you really feel that it would be better just to have an unlimited buildup. I'm speaking to you, Mr.
Yes.
Kolkowitz, and you, Mr. Young. Is that true?
Yes, that is true.
I would say that in terms of the people and groups that are opposed to the SALT Treaty, right now anyway, many of them seem to be saying that they would prefer the United States to continue to compete without any kind of arms control with the Soviet Union to try to achieve superiority again. And I think the problem I have with that point of view is that from everything I know, and this is supported by things that have been said by both the United States administration and the Soviet Union and by studies that have done, there is no such thing anymore as real superiority, meaningful superiority in the arms race. So in behalf of the Service Committee, we take a position that this is a small step toward controlling the arms race and reversing it, but a very small one, and we need to go much beyond SALT II in order to guarantee the security of people.
Mr. Kupperleff, in the Soviet Union today, is there any open discussion of the nature that we are engaging in here now about the coming SALT agreement?
Well, actually, I wouldn't say that there is as much discussion as it is here, because I presume in the Soviet Union it is simply not needed, because we trust our leaders, we trust our experts, we trust our military people. So there is kind of a unity on these issues. It doesn't mean that we are 100% satisfied with this treaty. There are some things which are going contrary to our wishes, but we admit that this treaty is a compromise, and this is it represents a very delicate balance of interests. So since it is based, as we consider, on the principle of equality and equal security, we are ready to accept it.
Do you think that a failure to reach agreement would have any singular effect upon the political or military relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, by word, you said singular?
Well, I mean to say that would it provide a
kind of a
condition of
crisis?
latent hostility, let us say? Would it, in future years, and not too far off, because the leadership of the Soviet Union is in the plus 70s right now, and new people are going to come up and go into control, obviously, that time being what it is. What effect would a lack of a signature, an agreement on SALT, have on the leadership that was coming up?
Well, it's probably not a question of leadership, since we have had a very consistent foreign policy, a very consistent policy in the area of arms control and disarmament for many years. But certainly I presume that the rejection of this treaty by the U.S. side would give a very bad indication to our people as a whole, and it's hard to predict how things would turn out, but I presume that they would not getting much better than now, and probably, as Mr. Brezhnev once told some of your senators, that it could lead to a return to Cold War times, and even worse. So if you just get into our shoes and try to evaluate the things, you would admit that it would be a very bad indication.
Well, we've heard some discussion now, ladies and gentlemen, of the pros and cons. This week, this reporter also spoke to Paul Warnke, the former chief negotiator and the main architect of SALT II, about his views on the treaty and how SALT will affect détente.
Countries regard SALT as the cornerstone of détente. If you get SALT, it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is going to improve spectacularly. But without SALT, you have no chance of any improvement in that relationship. I think a failure of SALT, after something like 6.5 years of negotiations under 3 presidents, 2 Republican and 1 Democratic, would indicate to the Soviet Union that we had decided that we just wanted to have an all-out confrontation. And they would respond accordingly. And as a consequence, our foreign policy position would be worsened. So I say, both looking at the terms of the agreement itself and looking at it as a part of overall foreign policy, it really is a very significant advance in the security of the United States.
I'm sure that the same letters cross your desk as hit our news desk.
Yes.
And that is, how can you deal with the Russians? How can you trust the Russians?
Well, you have to remember that SALT doesn't depend on trust. Now, the fact is, somewhat to my surprise, they don't trust us either. The fact is, we're rivals. We're highly competitive. We have very different views of the world. As a consequence, you have to have an agreement that does not depend on trust. Now, we can look at the provisions of the agreement itself and say that that demonstrates the negotiations have been serious, that both sides have been willing to work out an agreement which contributes to the security of both sides. The other thing you must be sure of is that you will know whether or not the other side is complying with those fair, equitable terms. And that's why the verification provisions are so important.
Mr. Kolkowitz, how would you describe yourself? Is yours a conservative viewpoint?
No, my view is my personal view, but I think it's based on many years of study of Soviet and American foreign defense policies, about 20 years. If you'll permit me, I would like to ask a question which might maybe bring into sharper focus some of the things. It's very difficult for a citizen to say SALT or arms control is bad. It's like attacking motherhood and apple pie. However, my concern with SALT, too, is that it is being oversold, that there's a kind of idea that it's either or. Either we have the treaty or nuclear war is around the corner. I believe this is doing a disservice to the American people and to the people at large. The reason why I'm concerned is every time we've had an arms control treaty or set of negotiations with the Russians, our negotiators came back to Washington and they brought back some agreement, and invariably our defense budgets went up, and it was necessary somehow provide greater strength to our side. And I must say the Soviet side did the same. Their defense budgets, their enormous arms programs have continued to grow. That's one concern of mine. The other one is that while we are focusing on SALT, on strategic arms limitation, we must also take a look at the non-strategic side of arms racing. That sector of the arms defense industries is completely out of control. I mean, the production and the trade in conventional arms, which cause a lot of mischief all around the world, and could possibly, in a catalytic way, create a nuclear war, somehow there's very little control. Therefore, I would like to ask Mr. Kapranov to possibly address these two issues, which are very much on my mind, and I'm sure on the mind of other so-called experts. We do not trust our experts as much, unfortunately, as you trust yours.
That's probably your problem.
We have many problems.
But
It's part of democracy.
I would gladly try to respond. First of all, I think that it's kind of a misleading approach to demand too much from the SALT Treaty and then to criticize it on the ground that the SALT Treaty doesn't satisfy all that demands. Certainly, as I try to indicate, SALT 2 is not a panacea. It is not going to solve all your problems, whatever you say about the defense problems or military expenditures problems, military programs. Certainly, it's not going to remedy all those things. On the other hand, we don't consider that SALT 2 is going to be answer to all problems we have. But we consider it a necessary step without which it would be much more difficult to proceed both in this direction of limitation of strategic arms and in other areas of arms control. On the other hand, it is we attach great importance political importance to the issue of SALT and how this issue is going to be resolved here. As I indicated, it would be a sign, bad or good, both our leaders and our people at large. I also would add that with regard to other arms control issues, I'm sure, and Al Pierce would probably confirm, that we have rather many discussions with the U.S. side on in other areas of arms control. The subject you addressed, conventional arms transfers, is currently under negotiations, and for that matter, it's the U.S. side who almost spoiled the whole matter just a few months ago. So we are very forthcoming here, and we are ready to limit to just disarm in any area with any given system, weapon system, provided that there is a principle of equality and equal security.
Mr. Pierce, what about the point that Mr. Kolkowitz made about the seeming eternal growth of arms in spite of agreements?
Well, I think I'd come back to the general comment that I tried to make earlier, which was that you can't expect any one treaty, any one piece of paper, to solve all of our arms control problems, or all of our defense problems, or all of our foreign policy problems, for that matter. I was in Washington yesterday, and someone was talking about the phenomenon of the arms race, pointing out what you indicated, that it seems that when we have an arms control treaty, we're only stopping part of it. And he said that it reminded him, the arms race situation, of sort of a stampede of horses, and you don't stop it all at once. You try to stop one horse over there, and when you do, you make some of the others nervous, and they speed up, and you have to tackle it from several different perspectives and points of view, and you try to stop it a bit at a time. And the delicate part of it is to try to stop the stampede without overturning the wagons in the process, and the wagons being security in this case. And I think that's why it has to be a many-front attack on the phenomenon of the arms race. And I think SALT makes a contribution. I think that while SALT will not necessarily make it easier to accomplish other parts of this process, I think that, in this case I agree with Paul Warnke, as I do in most cases, that I think it would be much more difficult to make progress on some of the other areas that you've indicated, conventional arms, comprehensive test ban, conventional forces in Europe, if SALT is unsuccessful. Let's keep in mind this is a treaty that the two countries have been negotiating now for over 6.5 years. And if we can't bring this one to a successful conclusion, then I think the whole process gets called into question.
We mentioned on the air that we have mentioned that this conversation was going to take place and we were going to look at the SALT II treaty. And this has generated some letters from our audience out there. And some of the questions I've received, one of them that I received, which I recall, was that a statement that we were all looking at the wrong thing, that instead of looking at intercontinental weapons and so on, what about those nuclear weapons in the hands of the ground forces, those that might be, you might say, overrun and lost as our aircraft were in Iran? And is SALT addressing itself to this at all, or is that something that would be studied at a future time following an agreement on SALT? Have you thought about that?
Oh, yes, we've thought about it. You're quite right that SALT does not address nuclear forces for tactical or theater use in Europe. Those are something that has to be addressed in a separate forum. We have tried, and I think successfully, to keep SALT confined to what we call the strategic systems. I think the problems of theater and tactical forces in Europe has to be addressed in a separate forum, obviously involving the participation of our NATO allies.
I wanted to comment briefly on the approach, the step-by-step approach that Albert was speaking to. From the point of view of the Service Committee, and I think a growing number of people, not only from groups that are traditionally thought of as peace groups, but from the religious community, from social service groups, healthcare workers, education, persons concerned with education and so forth, there's a growing awareness that more radical measures need to be taken to reduce expenditures for military use in order to provide the services that we need in this society. And I wanted to make reference to what I think is quite an impressive study that deserves our attention. That is a study by a group up at Harvard and MIT, which was first written up in the Scientific American last October, which made the case for $40 billion cuts in the military budget over a 10-year period, beginning with $18 billion this year. Now, that's a study that was done by people who are not pacifists, who are not for unilateral disarmament, but who make a case, and I think a well-reasoned case, though I'm sure people might disagree with it, a well-reasoned case for those kind of substantial cuts in our military budget, which would not hinder or hurt our national security. Those are the sort of order of issues that I'd like to see people dealing with, and if anyone had comments on it, it'd be good. It doesn't relate directly to SALT, except to show that SALT is really a very, very small step compared to what has to be done, and I think what can be done if we could muster the will in the country to press the government harder than we currently press it.
Well, what about the Soviet Union, Mr. Kripalov? Are you concerned with verification? Do you know?
Well, as far as I know, we consider that both sides have adequate means of verification. There are some provisions in the draft treaty which would probably create more problems for the Soviet Union with regard to verification. But we consider that we can assure adequate verification, and we believe that the U.S. side has all necessary means for adequate verification of the treaty.
I'm thinking of the encoding of the signals from those missiles that were being tested in your country not so long ago, and then protest against such action by our country and the agreement by your nation to stop doing that. Is there any possibility of anything of that nature occurring again on either side? Does it concern you that we might do it? Would you want to put a listening post in Mexico so you could check Vandenberg, And
as far as I know, this issue of telemetry information encryption has been successfully resolved. I don't know what is going to happen. I mean, if the U.S. side would apply a new technique of concealing something. But I know that it was resolved, and it's going not to create any problem with regard to verification.
Oh, my question probably goes to this. A moment ago, you heard me mention, Mr. Warnicki, that we get letters saying, how can you trust the Russians? And I'm wondering if there's letters going to the Kremlin saying, how can you trust the Americans?
Well, obviously, the differences we've had for years between our countries probably is the reason for that kind of a question, trust or distrust. But it's obviously not related to directly to SALT agreement. It's probably of more of broad nature. And well, the whole concept of detente, which of the relaxation of tension, which both of our countries started a few years ago, was to build up that trust. And to build up that trust, you have to deal with each other and to cooperate. It's the same as two people get together and to get to know each other more and more, and then only then they start to trust each other. Whereas the US side sometimes is not forthcoming in this direction with regard to cooperation and some kind of, for instance, trade or something like that.
Paul Warnke pointed out yesterday that there's a study that's been done by our own government about accusations made by the Soviet Union and the United States about possible violations of SALT I by either party. What the study revealed, this is a study by the US government, is that the Soviet Union had raised as many questions about possible US violations as the United States had raised about Soviet violations, and that the questions raised by both sides had equal validity, approximately. That is, that there were questions raised in both directions. And I think this is important for Americans to have a more sort of broader understanding of the process of developing trust between the two countries and the problems there are on both sides.
Go ahead.
I think that study indicates a couple of other things, and that is a publicly available version of that study. First of all, it illustrates, because the questions that both sides raised are very specific and detailed, by implication, you can get an understanding of how good our verification capabilities are. And secondly, it demonstrates that we have, through SALT I, created a mechanism to resolve questionable activities, and that the record of that mechanism is clear, that it works to our satisfaction.
Good. Gentlemen, I want to thank you. Believe it or not, we've used our time. Thank you for coming, sharing of your experience here, and I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that we've given all of us something to think about and a better understanding in a smaller way of what this is all about. Until our next broadcast, I thank you and bid you good night.
.28 Tonight is produced by KCET, which is solely responsible for its content.